This episode of A Brush With is sponsored by Bloomberg Connects, the app for arts and culture. Created by Bloomberg Philanthropies, Bloomberg Connects lets you access museums, galleries and cultural spaces around the world on demand. Download the app to access digital guides and explore a variety of content. Hello, I'm Ben Luke and welcome to A Brush With, the podcast where I talk to artists in depth about the fellow artists, writers, musicians and composers, film directors and others who've influenced them and continue to inspire them today, and the cultural epiphanies that have defined their lives and work. And in this episode, it's A Brush With Thomas J. Price. For 2 decades, Thomas has been making work about a subject that's now become a major cultural issue across the world, how the mechanisms of power are transmitted through statuary and public sculpture, and about the representation of diverse people in society, or rather, its absence. Thomas was born in London in 1981 and studied at the Chelsea College of Art and the Royal College of Art in London. He emerged into an art scene dominated by the impact of the young British artists of the 1990s. And in fact, his earliest mature work seemed to be a direct response to the kind of conceptual and video-based work that dominated that period. A performance called Litt, which was captured on film, it featured Thomas mapping the space of a gallery by licking its walls with unintended but dramatic effects, which you'll hear about later. But while he occasionally still makes video art, he soon embarked on a different approach to his work and instead focused on stop-motion animation and particularly on sculpture, albeit with a strong conceptual element. In their imagery and materials, Thomas's sculptures always ask questions about the nature and history of the medium and of the perceptions and biases of the viewer. His very early sculpture, Mixed Feelings About Bus Drivers from 2004, is a small white head realised in plaster mixed with marble powder to imbue it with the sheen of classical stone, so that it resembles the busts found in encyclopedic museums. But it's disarmingly presented on a humdrum piece of MDF and supported by a bracket of found wood. Ever since, Thomas has made work playing with issues of presentation. His series Angel Town, named after the social housing estate on which he grew up in South London, features full-length sculptures of figures in consciously modest poses. One, based on a man Thomas had seen in a betting shop, stands with one hand in his trouser pocket and a cigarette packet tucked into a pocket in his casual shirt. He and the other Angel Town figures are on plinths resembling those from municipal museums, but topped with brightly coloured platforms sprayed immaculately with car paints, a nod both to the visual language of the street, but also to modern sculpture. In his Newman series, meanwhile, Thomas created vast heads, clearly evoking ancient Egyptian sculptures and using the time-honoured lost wax casting method, but made them in aluminium, a material used in modern engineering, and set them on marble plinths as a contrast. Then, in his Untitled Icons series, again we see unavoidable references to the ancient world, with busts covered in 24-karat gold leaf, glistering like the pharaohs of ancient Egypt. Yet again, these are not deities but apparently ordinary people. Like most of his sculptures, until recently when he began representing women more frequently, the icons depict black men. He deliberately makes their expressions ambiguous, even inscrutable. Increasingly, Thomas has been making vast, full-length figures of men and women. The largest yet is featured in a show this autumn at Houser and Worth in Somerset. 12 feet high, it features a man standing with both hands in his tracksuit bottoms, wearing a hooded top and staring outwards. It's deliberately unheroic compared to the statues of generals and admirals, kings and imperialists, saints and martyrs that decorate our streets and squares. Yet it bears many of the same hallmarks as traditional statuary, a fine attention to drapery and to the objects or attributes that identify or classify the person and what they might signify, for instance. Thomas asks who gets to be represented in sculpture and what preconceptions do we hold when we see them, in their pose or in the way they dress. He calls his works psychological portraits, but that applies not just to those he depicts, but to us. He throws the audience's own psychology back at them. Remarkably though, despite the powerful presence of his figures, they're all imagined, constructed from people he sees as he navigates his native London or in images he finds in the media. And it's this with which I began our conversation. It seems an extraordinary feat, so how does he go about constructing these fictional yet vividly realised people?
It's quite a strange process. It's very involved and quite intense. I often get asked if I could do people's portraits, and I think that would be so easy to kind of copy something. But what I really am going for in the work is this very truthful, emotional or experiential kind of moments within the life of a character. And so, yeah, I can kind of composite these characters together around what I've started to call an emotional framework. So there is structure to them. There is a kind of a goal that I'm trying to reach, but it's sort of defined by a feeling. And I guess the kind of a feeling that I have. And I use these kind of elements of physiognomy, kind of the way that people's faces are formed and proportioned to support that feeling, or to kind of reach that moment where I feel that this person presents this sort of moment of truth. What do you think? And obviously using people that I feel familiar with, choosing people that I feel have been sort of left out of mainstream kind of conversations or history, or certainly outside of the kind of the sculptural references that I use. So the process is really a very internal kind of one of connecting to my own kind of feelings and thoughts, and trying to use physiognomy and objects to get there.
That's really fascinating. Can it be as sort of random as you're looking through a newspaper one day and you see a striking image, and equally you're walking down the street one day and you see a striking pose that's adopted by somebody that you pass? Yeah,
I mean, I literally get inspired by a moment that happens to me kind of, we'll say like day to day. I have walked in Camberwell, where I live, and seen someone drinking from a bottle, but looking so intensely. And it took about 5 seconds. And there I was just transfixed by how I'd felt about this person, the kind of the feeling they had manifested, for me at least. And I wanted to know, like, if I put this in front of you, will you feel the same way about this person? Because there's a whole expanse inside this person's head, and a whole world of experience and potential. And yet we limit the kind of the stories we give people, the narratives we give people so crazily depending on what they look like. But what happens if you try and place it into a different context? What happens if you give it the kind of a different provenance, and the supporting structure of the art gallery, or, the kind of the sculptural object, the historical object? I spend a lot of time staring at people, and some people just capture me without realizing it. And it can be just a moment in the eyes, or the way they stand, all these things that are such important cues for communicating personality and emotion.
And tell me about the eyes, because this is a really crucial factor in your work, because there's a lot of breadth in terms of your materials. But one of the really consistent elements is that the eyes, in terms of the irises, they're not three-dimensional. There are holes where the irises are. And that seems to me to be right across your work. Tell me about that.
Yeah, it's like the psychological moment, even in the animations where, got pins. When I put the pins in the eyes, they're actually hollow. And I've always said that I guess it's like a way to get the viewer to kind of feel that last moment of psychological responsibility, and to create that space for ambiguity and for potential for the viewer to really define what that last detail is, and to keep them engaged in this process of perception and of construction of personality, construction of potential for the person that they are creating. It kind of just emerged in the work. I studied a lot of the sculptures I'd see in museums. I'd go around going, how does this head meet a base? But also, just as importantly, what are these kind of traditions, these ways that other sculptors throughout history have handled the eyes, and where this person is looking, from like drawing them on kind of in low relief to some quite deep relief sort of details. But for me, it was just creating that hollow space. It just revealed that last little element of where that viewer is at, psychologically.
One of the things about your work is that you must, to a certain extent, conceive of a full person, even if it's arrived at through disparate sources. But how much of a narrative do you create around them?
Yeah, there's a physical narrative for this person, in terms of, so if it's just a head, one of the pieces in the show is a heavy-set person. And I imagine the whole body and how they would stand or how they would sit, because it's not a head in isolation, it's connected. But I choose to focus on that as a sculptural kind of element. But I remember when I was studying, I did, for one of the animations, try to kind of create a backstory, almost like a film writer would do, be much more narrative and literal. And I think it really revealed to me the power for me in ambiguity, and the power for me in not revealing, not trying to tie down these people to my own particular story for them. But the joy for me, or the interest for me, was in what someone else sees. And trying to connect my judgment to someone else's judgment, to talk about how we all make these judgments, and to talk about how we all create these stories, and how they are just stories, and how someone's personal truth changes depending on how they feel that day, or what they particularly think about that day. So for me, it was a moment where I discovered that, the kind of creating a defined narrative for me kind of removed the ambiguity, and realizing that ambiguity is a really important ingredient in what I do.
I wanted to ask you about this performance that you did called Litt, which was where you licked the walls of a gallery, and it ended up with your tongue bleeding, and so you were making marks, these blood marks on the walls of the gallery. And it seems to me that was conceptually incredibly rich. It succeeded on its own terms, and it was a really strong piece. And yet, afterwards, you kind of abandoned performance.
Yes.
So tell me why.
Well, I mean, Litt was actually originally supposed to be 2-part work. So it was a performance piece where I would cover this gallery space in an invisible layer of saliva. And that was about, can you get a sense of presence and communicate a sense of a person in that room, will that linger? It was also about this idea of belief and performance and spectacle and spreading rumors and how we communicate to one another. And then this idea of afterwards, when the room is empty, this kind of very quiet, subtle work, which again was all about connectedness or being connected or trying to connect. But when my tongue started to bleed very early on, which I had not thought about, there's never a chance I thought that was going to happen. But I remember when I first put my tongue to the wall, it just stuck. And I thought I'm going to be in trouble. But, I was young. And I managed to carry on. And it was quite early on, it started to bleed. But there was almost a moment of relief when it did, because it started to leave a mark. So I could actually kind of track where I'd been. But the work totally changed. It became this very physical and visible marker of like this effort to connect, this effort to connect my inner self to the world and to feel close. This kind of proximity to someone. So it achieved all the things I wanted it to achieve and more, with the spectacle of the blood. But it did make me very conscious of, again, like where for me the kind of the importance and the power in my works were. What road would I go down? Would I start creating more and more sort of extravagantly daring performance pieces? Like, how much was I going to have to bleed, And why? Like, what was that trying to do? Was that just entertaining? What I was trying to do was really talk about the essence of communication and the essence of the interpersonal connections or interactions. And I realized I was interested in people, and I was interested in people's reactions, but almost when people were talking about the work, I was more interested looking at them, trying to think through what it was they were thinking about the work or feeling about the work. And I'm doing it now as I'm trying to think about, this answer. I'm like, my eyes are moving to certain parts of my face. And it was those moments of real psychological honesty that fascinated me. And it kind of moved me towards this idea of, animating spaces. So activating a space like the Litt did. But how else can you animate space? So I went through a series of kinetic works. I started with performance anyway, with sound and light. But I moved towards the animations, the stop motion animations, because that was really that was substance, it was touch, it was, the expanding of time through the analysis of a moment, and then the condensing of that time as you play it back, real speed. And it got to the core of what I'm trying to do. It got to making people aware of these processes and making people aware of the worlds they carry with them and how that affects, their external experiences.
I wanted to also think about, because you touched on it there, about that sort of direct connection with an audience, because you said that in a way, the honesty that you get in terms of a response from a public work is totally different from that than you would within a relatively cosseted space of an art gallery to a certain degree. And so putting works out in public actually draws such a broad range and, as you say, a very directly honest response. Tell me about that. And in a way, it's a test for the work, isn't it?
It really, it's a very harsh test sometimes. There is an absolute energy to work in the public realm, which is very hard to replicate in a gallery space. And why would you replicate it when you've got the public realm? So for me, work's about how we as society construct truth, power, ideas of power, ideals themselves. I think they exist so well in the public realm where they can be critiqued by the public, where they can meet the public, and be activated by the public. And I love the opportunity to place these sort of psychological propositions and these critiques of statues, these sculptures about statues, back into the public realm to be absorbed again by the public and sort of processed through public opinion, but acknowledging the individual's opinion And it really reveals the expectations that we harbor as society through the individual comments. What do we expect to see? Like, why that person? Or who is that? It always has to be a real person. Oh, is it a sportsman? It always has to be someone who's done something great. And I love to expose these expectations and these traditions or tropes that we function within and that we ultimately support through our expectations and often rejections of work that doesn't conform. And I think there's been, early days there was some resistance to my works because well, why is it of nobody? Well, it is of somebody, but who is it? But why is it not someone who's famous? Why is it not someone, who's better than me? So there's this it reveals this sort of element of internalizing of a system that essentially abuses power, and it gets us to be complicit in that abuse. And I think my works are really for me at least, trying to free us up from that, free myself up from that through the process of making the works and then through the process of exhibiting them in a public space. It's about trying to engage with real people in a realm and a sphere where they have the power.
Yeah.
And so they can feel that they can engage. Because the reason I use figurative works is because everybody kind of has something to say about what someone looks like. If I leant a ladder up against the wall and put a cabbage on it, not so many people would perhaps feel able to comment on that. I would, but maybe not everybody. But I wanted to make works which felt accessible so that they would entice people to engage, but still on the same kind of rigorous criteria of critique and concepts that runs through any work that's in a gallery or, anywhere where we'd expect to see kind of artworks, but in a space where they could be encountered by people who I wanted to speak to.
Let's move on to the questions we ask all our guests. So who was the first artist whose work you loved?
I think the first artist whose work I loved. Love is a strong word, but I think I was really drawn to the work of Giacometti, particularly the sculptures. And I think it's because I was making wire sculptures since I was a child. I was very lucky. My mother's very, very creative, and she would give me bits of wire and I'd make these kind of figures out of them when I was a young child. And I'd always make them quite elongated. And I think because I'm a bit lanky, so I kind of made these people. And then I suddenly saw these objects, these people that looked a bit like the things I was doing. And I was a young kid, and I saw these works and I was like in motion as well. It was mainly the male figures, I guess, because his male figures are in motion. And I was really enticed by that. And he kind of kept me captured, trying to explore his work for a long time.
One of the things I always love about Giacometti's work is that there's that direct connection with drawings. And I wondered about, is there a sort of backstory to your work?
Drawings.
Well, that's it. Are there drawings? Yeah.
There are. I mean, I try and look at drawings as purely functional, which is, impossible really. There's always aesthetic decisions going on, but they're a way for me to work through different ideas. And I started out doing quite almost kind of like cartoonish type drawings with text and quite narrative and sort of satirical. I think I've always had a sense of humour that runs through my work to kind of cope with everything else. But the sort of drawings I do now are quite diagrammatic, or have always been diagrammatic. There's a mixture, diagrammatic and sort of structural. But often, whilst I've been doing the residency here in House of Worth, I've been playing with drawing again in a way that I didn't have space for a long time, or time to do, really. And it's just been so freeing in terms of connecting the body to thought. And I think that's the thing that drawing for me can do. It connects the body to thought, which filters through everything else you do. And I always love looking at artists' drawings or sketches or doodles because you get that insight into the way of thinking, the way of problem solving, which a finished work sometimes doesn't speak to. So I'm trying to do more drawing. It's a discipline.
You mentioned humour there, and I think that's a really important thing because, for instance, you've done these standing nude figures. And in one of them, I noticed that he was wearing shoes. In another one, he's holding a mobile phone. And there is a sort of absurdity to them. And I wondered if you feel that like there's an essential element of humour. It's not necessarily right on the surface. It's not necessarily really obvious. But it's there still in the sense that these are deeply serious works of art, but there are elements in them which catch you off guard as a viewer. Yeah,
I think because those are the moments of pure honesty, where... Perhaps if you were, no one's going to have their photo taken like that. You're gonna, you'll be fully clothed, or no one wants to be seen like that. So it speaks to these moments of honesty and vulnerability, which are hard to fake. Maybe I'm faking them in the sculptures, but it's trying to speak to this sense of of power in vulnerability. If you don't have to constantly be on guard, like when you drop the guard, it's quite a powerful moment. And I think maybe as I've got older, I've kind of realized that more in a personal way, but I was making these, quite some time ago. And I think intuitively, I was trying to make works which spoke about vulnerability, but without it being pathetic. Vulnerability as a strength. But also, the objects, I call them attributes for me, are direct comments on the attributes and elements that we'd see in kind of classical sculptures, Western classical sculptures, which would be used to identify who these people were. So I guess I was always talking about the cues that we use in society to form understandings of identity within others and how we can use those ourselves to try and project an understanding of identity. But yeah, for me, it really comes down to, kind of an acceptance of vulnerability and acceptance of the absurdity of life and trying to embrace it as opposed to be bruised by it,
Absolutely. Which historical artists do you return to the most now?
Maybe thematically, someone like Phidias, who was an ancient Greek sculptor with quite epic proportions, with the Parthenon and things like that. When I was at school, I studied classics, and it really had a massive impact on me. I got a scholarship to a private school, which is something I never thought I would do, but it gave me an insight into a world that exists, particularly in structures of power in the UK. But this whole idea about the ambition of these works, but also the humanity of them, the intense humanity of these works. But I think, obviously, again, around the figurative, because as I look at and try and critique figurative works, someone like Rodin, I did some of the commentary for the Tate show for Rodin recently, which was quite a revelation, to really get a moment to kind of think through a lot of his works, the Burghers of Calais and all this kind of thing. Well, I'm trying to think someone else like painter, Giorgio Morandi.
Oh, how interesting.
Yeah, nobody ever thinks, why would you like... It's because it's the kind of intensity of inquiry and almost that repetition, but the subtleties in it and how these shifts bring such different meanings to his paintings. And I've just been absolutely, since I was a child, been totally kind of enamored with those works. Probably just quite a weird one, but
that's really fascinating because one of the things about Morandi that I love is that sort of sense of a kind of, you talked about the vulnerability of the people that you're depicting, but there's a sort of rigor and sort of solidity of those works, but there's an incredible emotional vulnerability about them, right?
Yeah, the way that palette just shimmers, the tonality of it all, it's just so well handled and considered, and it's just masterfully kind of rendered in that sort of, someone that understands the subject and has a love for that subject. And I think, running through my works is a love for the subject and the people that I'm trying to create. It's, all the work I put in, even when I was licking a room, it's like all that effort is about, because I care, it sounds ridiculous, but because I want to connect and I want people to feel like they can connect. And I think, Morandi has that in his paintings.
That's fascinating. Let's return to classical sculptures because I'm really interested in the way that you respond to them. So if you think about the 18th century and the way that classical statuary was used then, they adopted the poses and there was a kind of heroic power to the way that the 18th century translated the classical world for its contemporary audience. I'm really interested in what you're translating, if you like, from the classical world and to what extent it's a subversion or to what extent it's homage. Tell me about that.
Yeah, I think my work responds to the way that NeoClassicism sort of celebrates the heroic and the way in which, people, generals and all these kind of individuals who are presented in these most glamorous ways, of celebratory ways, who've actually done really terrible things, are portrayed. And I think, my work places kind of the figures that I want to put focus on into that context, into contrast with those people. These are people who are being celebrated for having done, quashed a rebellion or, or triumphed in a particular continent and who are being celebrated. And yet, here's a figure wearing a hooded top who's walking home and is shot or just standing in the street with his hands in his pockets and is thought of as, suspicious. And I think there is a contrast there. And so I do utilize the sort of the way in which, these ideals have been sort of incorporated into society through the art objects. Through the statues in our cities, who knows their names, but we all know the sort of the postures. And I think, the way that my works refuse to hold the sort of same bombastic posturing as these traditional statues is very conscious. And it's about a statement of intent and it's about a statement of what I think is important. And I think we do need to reconsider the way that we are, allowing these negative attitudes to affect people's lives. And the amount of attention or thoughts and chances we give to one person and the absolute lack of empathy and attention we give to someone else. And I think, through the sculptures, particularly the figurative works, which do resonate against the traditions of statues, that's where I'm trying to push at these issues. And by utilizing these very understood visual languages in a way that says, I'm not going to try and be as good as you. I'm not going to try and be, okay, I now can also be in the same guise as a 17th century French courtesan, I don't want that. My figures they're not shoulders back, trying to get, the approval or trying to show how much better they are than you. They are separate to that system. They're saying we don't want to be part of that system. They're trying to be these moments of truth and lack of need to project a particular image, because that's the ideal, right? That for me would be like the most tranquil place to be. That's where I'd love to be. If I could walk down the street without having to worry about how I was coming across to someone who's approaching me, that's a wonderful space to be in. And sometimes it does happen, and it feels great. But then there's the anxiety that you have to carry around with you about checking yourself and making sure. And I think, sculpting these moments of vulnerability or truth for me is this kind of celebration of that kind of freedom and a reaffirmation of my need for that and my wish that other people feel this. And the people I know who don't feel that, I say, we can get this.
Yeah.
But, but how are we going to get there? Because we need everyone to be involved.
And has it felt odd to see the territory of your work become an enormous political hot potato, in the sense that statues are now the subject of debate in societies and directives by government across the world?
You know what? It can only be a positive thing. It can only be a positive thing. I'm really happy that suddenly, oh, right, yeah, statues, they have importance, they have significance. They communicate things to us unconsciously. They are affirmations of intent and belief, and they affect societies as well as individuals. People have been saying this for a long time. I've been making work about this for a long time. And nobody wanted to know at the beginning. If I'm honest, nobody wanted to know about that. They go, okay, who is this person? Oh, it's not someone real. Okay, move on. And I was trying to say, no, look at the reference points. Look at the potential in terms of the different system that we can employ, the different values we can have if we don't have to just have famous, powerful, triumphant conquerors. What about if we celebrate the humanistic qualities that can connect us all, that resonate within us, that we really do want? So that itself has been an amazing kind of thing to witness. And, on a personal level, it's quite funny that, suddenly everybody's telling me about statues and how important the figure is. I'm like, I'll read up on that. But it's so, ultimately it can only be a good thing. I'm happy, and I'm certainly happy that my work is now reaching an audience that it didn't before, in a way, and an audience who's now open to it. And so hopefully, the changes that can happen and the conversations that can happen will be richer and longer lasting. So, I'm really excited about where we're going. I just, want to make sure that we keep moving in that direction, and that it's not a blip.
This episode of A Brush With is sponsored by Bloomberg Connects, the app for arts and culture. The app offers access to more than 40 cultural institutions through a single download, with new partners being added every month. There's a huge variety of institutions on the app, each with an individual guide. For instance, there are guides to 3 institutions who show outdoor sculpture. There's the Noguchi Museum, with its garden designed by Osamu Noguchi so that his works could be seen amid plants and beneath the open sky. And then sculpture parks on both sides of the Atlantic. The Socrates Sculpture Park, close to the Noguchi Museum in Queens in New York, and the Yorkshire Sculpture Park, where Thomas had a solo show in 2014, alongside the dozens of sculptures shown amid beautiful landscapes near Leeds in the UK. In Bloomberg Connect's guides, you can discover unique audio content, hear from artists and curators in exclusive videos, explore exhibitions, past and present, and plan your visit in advance. To explore guides to all the partnering institutions, download Bloomberg Connects today. You can find the app at bloombergconnects.org, and it's also available to download from the App Store and Google Play. Let's move on to museums now. Which museum or gallery do you visit the most?
Oh, I was quite lucky as a child that my mother would take me and my brothers to lots of different museums because they were free and we didn't have a big house. So she'd try to get us out of the house and take us to museums. I've explored the British Museum a lot. But I think the British Museum is a place that has a lot of issues going on with it. And, the more I kind of walk around there, the more I see. And I think, I used to love going through into the Africa rooms. But then I realized that why are they in the basement? And why are they so dark? And why are they sort of like this sort of strangely, not spiritual, but kind of this strangely dark sort of atmospheric space where the Western and even the Viking kind of work is up in the top galleries and really light and bright and looks beautiful. But I do love the space, and the kind of exploring the world in one building is quite an amazing kind of experience, and I feel really privileged for that. But I think the V&A was another place, But I think maybe it's the spaces I engaged with. This idea of being able to explore and lose yourself, even like the National Theatre in the South Bank. I spent a lot of time before the Millennium Bridge was built, walking around there with my family on very wet days, running around the concrete buildings, getting lost in the festival hall. But obviously, the Tate in its many guises has always been a place that I've been lucky enough to go to. And I used to pop in every now and again to say hi to some particular works. I'd go and literally, because it's free, which is, such a blessing in this country. You can pop in, and just look at some works and take some time to kind of take a breath and experience something quite beautiful. And
I'm imagining sculpture, but of course it may not have been sculpture. But just because you're a sculptor doesn't mean you only look at sculpture.
I've always been fascinated with painting. I've actually started painting now. I've had some space, and I've always been fascinated with the different way of seeing and the way of processing information, the way of trying to translate something and presenting it. And that way, I definitely do it like a sculptor. I definitely think in terms of space and tangibility. But so my concerns are that of a sculptor, but I absolutely love painting, and I think some of my favourite works are paintings. But yeah, I mean, I would walk in to see Giacometti's pieces just because of the way that you can get a sense of the way they play with space and perspective that you can't get from a book.
Which cultural experience changed the way you see the world?
I mean, go back to another kind of show that I went to. I saw Sonic Boom at the Hayward Gallery in 2000. Before I started art school, I was leaving sixth form, and I decided I was going to try and do a foundation instead of joining the Royal Marines, believe it or not. And
good decision.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think so. And it blew my mind. It showed me that arts can be a thought or be an experience, and sound can exist as a physical thing. And once you start reinterpreting what you thought you knew, that kind of opens the gates to anything can be kind of reconsidered. And it brought so many different things into play. It brought the space into play as a material, resonance into play as a material. And I think even the sculptures I do play with space. I've always talked about animating spaces, the push and pull effect of scale, animations that actually move but are flat, but have this kind of sense of tangibility because their surfaces change where my hands have touched them. Photographs that look at the hands. But this show about sound made me think about touch and made me think about space and ultimately about how we connect.
That's wonderful. And obviously you're a sculptor, but it's really crucial how you install your works. There are forms of installation and sort of immersion that exist around your sculptures, aren't there?
Yeah. I think the modes of display, as I kind of tend to call it, incredibly important because it's part of the critique of sculpture. Sculpture for me isn't just about the object. It's about how an object is placed. Why a plinth? The old kind of question about the plinths. I love plinths because they're so fun to play with, and in terms of getting people riled up about how he used them. My works in public don't go on plinths because I don't want to be part of that same system that uses plinths to say we're better than you. But inside I like the plinth because it really does change about how someone approaches a work. Because I guess I've come from a conceptual perspective. It's not just like I love being there with some clay and making a sculpture because that's what we do. It's really about why do people make sculptures? Why do people respond to these things in space? How do we relate to them bodily and mentally? And so, yeah, the where and the how is incredibly important to that understanding. And so the placement, the height, the material of what they're standing on is just as important to me as the object. And I like the way that a reconfiguration of that can totally change the experience. So, one of the larger works, for example, indoors is different to how it is outdoors. And for me to have that kind of ability or that expansiveness within using the same work but in a different place is really valuable. And it's, again, part of the concept. I talked about using space. Well, how do we use it and what effect does it have on us? It's a game, isn't it? It's like you're playing this kind of playful nature of experimentation, I think should be there in work. And certainly if you want to enjoy it. And I absolutely love these experiments in material and space and in display and seeing what people do with it.
Let's talk about literature now. Which writer or poet do you turn to the most?
I think I'm pretty terrible on literature, to be honest. I'm really, really dyslexic, so I end up listening to a lot of books now, which I find quite good because I can do it in the studio sometimes as well. But I was always so slow at reading, it became almost a trial. But I remember actually reading Things Fall Apart at school. And it's not like a text I go back to think about art, but it is a book that made me feel a particular way or realize something when I was at school, when I was studying. It put these two different kind of cultures in context and made me realize that my reception to that book was very different to some people in the class, and my kind of almost the characters I was rooting for might have been different, But it was also, I remember like doing a drawing instead of an essay in my book because I couldn't handle the essay. But I don't know. I think I've never really used writings as a starting point for anything, and I did listen to some amazing stuff where people were talking exactly that about how writing would be the starting point for work, and I've never really done that. I've never really illustrated ideas in that way. I've certainly conversations. So I think it's more like people are the things I keep returning to, and conversations are the thing I return to. I think that's why lockdown was so tough in a way, that those moments of opportunity, those moments of where you just have a running conversation with someone, which would like just put that idea in your mind or spark something, was sort of taken away. You can have a conversation on the phone, okay, but it's that interpersonal, in the same space kind of thing that has that energy and that all those things that in my work, for example, all these things that communicated non-verbally were there. So there were certainly ideas I return to, but I'm not someone that's been led by texts, I have to say. Maybe that can change.
Which music or other audio do you listen to as you're working?
So I once had a tutor way back in the day say that one of my animations was operatic. I'm not sure if that was supposed to be an insult, but I loved it because I love opera. I remember the first time I listened to opera, it was I found a CD in a car boot sale. And I listened to this opera. I had no idea what they were saying. It was Italian. It was The Force of Destiny. But the emotion in it carried me away, and the journey and the sort of the narrative structure of the sounds and the composition, this idea of composition, and how balance can be achieved over a span of time, and the kind of different structures sort of really blew my mind as a kid and opened me up to this world of experience. It sounds weird, like from a small little council house in Brixton, and I was listening to these operas about Italian countryside, and it just made me think about, it let me journey in my mind, and then that kind of moved me towards, I was always into blues and jazz, and Abdullah Ibrahim, his Senzo album. It's one I've talked about before but I just find it so transformative. I listen to that and it's incredible. I can't listen to it in the studio really though.
Right.
I actually have a lot of silence in the studio because I get into the music so much that I just want to listen to the music and process the music.
Yeah.
But sometimes I do. If I'm doing something repetitive, I can listen to music. Sometimes you have to just to get through the physicality of some of the stuff I do. But, I listen to all sorts really, but nothing that really is going to take me away from it. There's a lot of hip hop that goes on, though, if I really need to kind of get myself in the mood for like getting some serious work done, like quantity wise.
Oh, that's really interesting because of course there are lots of different modes of your work, aren't there? Different phases. You've increasingly been using digital processes. So tell us about that. The different modes and the way that there are different sort of passages within the gestation of a work.
Yeah, it's really nice actually to have these different processes and elements that kind of keep it fresh and keep it interesting and keep me engaged. I have sanded for days, at an end, and it's mind numbing. But yeah, with the digital process, it really came from, I started making work and I was using wet clay and then oil-based clay. And even that was a big change for me, using a clay which isn't dry, which allowed me to do more detail, which allowed me to keep a work out overnight and consider it and get closer and handle it in ways that you can't necessarily do with wet clay. So that changed the kind of the form of the works to these smaller, much more detailed pieces. And then when I started to look at digital clay, I call it digital clay, it allowed me to rotate an object in space in a way that I wouldn't have been able to do with a physical object. But it also allowed me to do kind of comparisons in a way. Instead of this linear way of working, this way of make a change, follow that change, make another change, follow that change, I was able to kind of branch out a sculpture into several different versions, look at them simultaneously, and really start to analyze and look at this idea of nuance. I've talked about nuance before in the work, but to really do comparative nuance. And that sort of led me to this ability really I have now, which is to kind of create a character which kind of moves through the work, but in different guises or in slightly different poses, to show just how a subtle shift in nuance can really throw, in a huge impact in terms of the understanding of the work. And like I was saying, like how these subtle gestures can have huge impacts for our experiences of the world, depending on how people view them. So, hands in the pockets, like all in, a 12-foot piece all in with guy standing with hands in his pockets. Then you got within the folds, which is the same character, pretty much the same stance, slight change in the head shift, but his hands are out of his pockets. And just, it's kind of using that as a conceptual strategy to make us aware of the ways that we see the world and the way that we kind of view people.
Is there a discipline in your daily working life that you see as an essential ritual?
In all honesty, I kind of think of this thing that people call creativity. I think of it as a discipline and something that needs to be exercised and kept sharp. And for me, and I think it's always personal. It's about being able to hold something quite gently in your mind and let it form. And there's those subtle kind of touches that manipulate it and utilize it, and turn it into something else that manifests it physically through whatever artwork you make. So for me, it's a type of thought, which some people call creativity. But for me, it's practiced, almost meditation, resulting in something else. It doesn't have to be physical. I'm just saying it doesn't have to be physical, but it's like gently holding that thought and letting it and learning to manipulate it kind of consciously.
If you could live with one work of art, what would it be?
That is such a hard question. Maybe I could just try and move into a museum and live there. I don't know. I think, I used to say I go to the Tate and look at the head of Diego by Giacometti. I'm a big fan of the Ife, brass heads though. I guess they're quite figurative at the moment. Or something by Kerry James Marshall. I mean, almost anything by Kerry James Marshall, to be honest. There's an artist with such rigor and just absolute beauty in the work and consistently... I think a fantastic artist. I was lucky enough to meet him once, and it's just a lovely guy, and just, one of those paintings. They're so rich, and you could just keep looking and looking and looking and looking and always find something new. I think maybe something like that would be good.
That sounds like a good choice to me. And lastly, what's art for?
That's a good question. I think it's art for asking questions like that. I think it's really, I used it as a way to kind of filter my life through this process of engagement to try and find some sort of understanding. And maybe to distract myself from everything else that's going on. I think art is for making space for ideas and making space for acceptance of who we are.
Thomas, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thomas J. Price, Thoughts Unseen, is at Hauser & Wirth in Somerset, UK, until the 3rd of January 2022. His sculpture, The Distance Within, is now on view in Marcus Garvey Park in New York as part of the Studio Museum in Harlem's collaborative series In Harlem. That's until the 1st of October 2022. He's just installed another large-scale sculpture, Reaching Out, at the Donham Estate, a winery in Sonoma, California. And an edition of that work is already in place on The Line, the walking route of public sculpture in London. Another version of it is in the Hauser & Wirth Somerset show. Lastly, Thomas's work for the Windrush Commission, honouring the Windrush generation of African Caribbean people in the London borough of Hackney, will be unveiled next year. And that's it for this episode. Please subscribe to A Brush With wherever you're listening, and do give us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts. And do also subscribe to our other podcast, The Week in Art, a deep dive into the latest big art world stories, the top shows and the key issues every Friday. We're on Twitter @TanAudio and on Facebook and Instagram, of course. Production, editing and sound design on A Brush With are by David Clack, and the producers of the Art Newspaper podcasts are Judy Mahauska and Amy Dawson. Thanks to Henrietta Bentel, Daniela Hathaway and Kabir Jallow. Huge thanks to Thomas J. Price. We'll be back soon with more episodes. See you then. This episode of A Brush With is sponsored by Bloomberg Connects. Download Bloomberg Connects today and discover cultural institutions on demand.